Can you hear me now?
I hear.
Fantastic. Okay, then we will start off and I will share something with you if this all goes well. You should all be seeing something in a few seconds. Sorry about that delay. There we go. So this is in connection with my was with my second exam. I did a paper on developing pastoral guidelines for dealing with gender dysphoria. One of the things we have to clear before we start with anything is kind of the terminology we want to use, because often in these cases, especially in the transgender debate or in any of these debates, the terminology is often left, it's very ambiguous from one side to the next. So just to clarify what I'll be meaning, if I talk about sex, I talk about the biological sex that a person is born as or was conceived as. Gender would be in this, for this paper or for this presentation, we're talking about the gender that a person perceives to be, if they are man or woman. And then transgender would then be a person who's suffering gender dysphoria. And I know there are many different types of terminologies or definitions that could be used. This is just what we'll be using. So why is this paper necessary in the first place? The first place is because it will also become a problem for us. This is sadly not just something that is to be seen far away in, say, only America and all the Western problems. No, it is also becoming a problem here for us. And it's also not a problem that will be going away anytime soon. It is something that we will have to deal with. And we can see this quite clearly that especially as gender dysphoria comes with quite a lot of negative and extreme consequences, it's not something that we should be taking lightly or should, as a church, ignore. And we cannot be unprepared for this huge, or it's not necessarily a huge thing, but rather a big problem that will be there, and ignoring it will not really work. We will not really be talking about, just to kind of make a definition, we will not be talking about homosexuality explicitly, but we will address it a bit, because how homosexuality was handled in the past, not by us, but by politics and society, has a big impact on how gender dysphoria is being seen today. And yeah, so what is gender dysphoria? Most of you probably have some idea, but I will give a bit of a definition. So the first definitions we have here is basically just two very long definition of a person who has to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. There's a marked difference between the individual experienced gender and the gender others would assign him or her. And it must continue for at least 6 months. In children, the desire to be of the other gender must be present and verbalized. This condition causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, and other important areas of functioning. And discrepancy between one's sex and gender is the core component of the diagnosis. Gender dysphoria is manifest in a variety of ways, including strong desire to be treated as the other gender or to be rid of one's sex characteristics, or a strong conviction that one has feelings or reactions typical to the other gender. So while this definition may focus a lot on the distress experienced rather than the, or rather, while it might overemphasize that, this distress should not be ignored. This is a real distress that these people feel, and this is also something that we should then take seriously. And while mostly gender dysphoria is split into two categories, I have found that it is easier actually to categorize it a bit further. So normally it is categorized in adults and children, and that's it. But with what I've experienced or seen already, it's easier to maybe already split it into 4 categories. And even though 2 of these categories are technically not to be understood as gender dysphoria, it is often that all of these get treated like gender dysphoria by our whole society, by us ourselves, and by other people as well. So it's because of that, we should maybe look at them and actually see them as 4 categories, because the problem is if you see them only as 1 category, you try to deal with them all the same, and that leads to other problems which we'll talk about now. So first we have disorder of sex development. I'll explain them all in detail now. Then we have persistent gender dysphoria, then transient gender dysphoria, then rapid onset gender dysphoria. Don't worry too much about understanding all of those. I will get into it. So the first one is disorder of sex development. That's, I think, one that we already knew of for a long time already, most of us. It is what we call, it is in the first case very rare, and it's what we call hermaphrodites in the normal layman's terms. It's those who have some sexual ambiguity in their sex. So it could be one born with both sexual organs, but it's not always clear if it's a boy born with, say, parts from a woman or other way around. This sexual ambiguity can go down to a chromosomal level that you have, that it really does make it very ambiguous. But like I said just now, this is a very, very rare thing. This does not happen a lot. That is it's a true exception to the norm. Yeah, so like I said, we call them hermaphrodites, or as it is now called, intersex is often also. And this is not really gender dysphoria, because with disorder of sex development or intersex, these people actually have something physically wrong with them. There's a physically something disordered in their body, whereas gender dysphoria is purely a psychological thing. So as such, there may be a cause to actually treat the body and the mind when dealing with disorder of sex development, but we'll talk a bit about that later. But because of this person, because of this incongruence in the body, it is also often that people like this may develop gender dysphoria of a type, that if they have both, will feel some distress in their body. If they have both sex, or we have the binary rule. And I think that's a good basis to build on, is that the exception proves the rule rather than the exception breaks down the rule. And that is something that we'll still keep in this thing. And I've talked about those 2, yes. Then we come to persistent gender dysphoria. This is now what most people would call gender dysphoria in and of itself. Again, this is also very, very rare. There's a reason why we haven't heard about gender dysphoria as much in the past as we do now, is that these disorders, this dysphoria, is very, very rare. And maybe we should say it should be very rare, because the problem is there's a dramatic increase in people being referred into this category. Suddenly, in the last few years, it's a huge increase that's going above all other expectations and what it has been. And so this can be 2 things. Can do 2 things. This could be due to the rising awareness that people actually know what the gender dysphoria is, and therefore they take that. Or it could be part of the looping effect, which is a very interesting thing, where people often construct their identities on known medical conditions. So the rise of awareness in gender dysphoria can therefore lead to an increase in people perceiving to have gender dysphoria. And so that could be one of the reasons, but it may also be because people do mistreatment or misdiagnosis, rather. Like I said at the beginning, it's if people put all the 4 categories into one, it may happen that we have some problems, and I'll get to explain why that is. Because the main people, as rare as it is, gender dysphoria, it's even rarer, or it is the most rare, is the persistent gender dysphoria, because most people who have gender dysphoria, they do not continue to have this dysphoria continuing into adulthood. It's transient, so it stops as soon as they finish with puberty. This does not mean that all the problems go away. It just means the gender dysphoria goes away. They are still often deal with identity issues and all other things, but gender dysphoria stops after puberty at 73% of the time. That's just a rough estimate. That means of all the people who suffer gender dysphoria as children or in that puberty area, 27 of them only persist. And that's a huge amount if you think of it, especially because it has been seen that medical treatments of, especially if you medically treat a person who is transient, that means the one that would have desisted, this may cause them to persist in gender dysphoria. This means that the person who's transient, and if you treat them, is suddenly no longer transient and continues to have gender dysphoria. And this becomes a big problem is because they both look exactly the same at the very beginning. If you're transient or persistent, it seems to be exactly, there is no way of knowing which one you'll be until puberty ends. And then the last one is rapid onset gender dysphoria. And this is something that happens fast, as it is labeled. It is rapid. And it is on this fact, it's built on this thing that gender dysphoria should be rare, even with if you take the disorder of sexual development, if you take persistence onto their things, and also if you take also transient, persistent, and disorder of sexual development, if you take those all together, it should be very rare. Oh, now I seem to have lost my content. Sorry. Bring it back quickly. Back. Sorry. There we go. I found where we are. So, and that is why, and I agree with this one doctor who said, it seems to be that this is not a medical case anymore that we're dealing with, or just a medical case, but rather a social craze that we're dealing with, because becoming transgender suddenly has become something that gives very high social value, something that online communities often support. And especially now, if you're dealing with all the confusions with puberty, going through puberty, it's no wonder that you suddenly have so many adolescents coming out as transgender, because now they have this whole support group that they're going about. This does not mean that there's no dangers that are set with this rapid onset gender dysphoria. It's also there will be also problems dealing with people like this. But we're now dealing with a lot of adolescents who define themselves or want to define themselves free from outside influences, even free from the outside influence of their own body. Because we see this even more in our society or our culture, is that the individual is being lifted to such a height that nobody can disagree with them, basically. There cannot be anything wrong with this individual. Rather, it is something wrong with society. Or, in this case, there's something wrong with the body, because the individual has become even more important than the body. He's defined outside of his body. And that is why we want to define these things very clearly, because as we can see, we have 4 categories that are completely different, and treating them the same could lead to much damage, could lead to long-lasting damages. But it's sad that often the disorder of sexual development is used as a thing to explain gender dysphoria, because you have some people who are actually suffering physically physical disorders, and then you're using that as an excuse to deal with somebody who has just a purely psychological disorder. Which is why I think it's the first thing we want to do is clarify who are we dealing with when we're dealing with a transgender person. So how does the world deal with this? Now, not all the world, but I'm just being a bit facetious now. So one of the biggest things that they did was change the definition. You may not have heard of gender dysphoria because it's not that new, or it is rather that it is quite new, because it was used to call gender disorder. And it was changed not due to medical reasons, but purely out of political pressure. No new scientific evidence was put in, only political pressure. And this is where homosexuality comes in a bit, because that same homosexuality, that same pressure from happened with homosexuality to say this is not a disorder now, and they were like, okay, we've done it with homosexuality, now we're going to go and say this disorder here, we can't call this a disorder, that's dealing with a person's identity. And so it wants to deal with this question of why do they do this? And the interesting thing is, from moving it from a disorder to a dysphoria, not longer considering it a mental health disorder, we are now saying this person, what is wrong with him is no longer that he thinks he's a woman, but rather that he is upset that he thinks he's a woman. So medical professionals and psychologists are now encouraged to deal with the dysphoria, the discomfort of dealing with a person who's no longer, who's not feeling right, and taking that away so that they feel okay with thinking that they are a woman, if that makes somewhat sense. It's disorder in the person's to being the unwanted emotional state. And this also has something to do with that treatment is often seen, or treatment of a disorder is seen as very negative. And this also sadly has some, ground to stand on, because we did see that, and this is where homosexuality comes in again, is we did see how homosexuality was often treated as a disorder, was often not in a very humane way or done in a way to help the person, but often rather to remove the problem. But if treatment is focused only on the dysphoria experience rather than the broken identity, then we can also expect there to be issues in how we come to helping people. So how is treatment done then? So we have two options. If you have gender dysphoria, you have two options open to you from the beginning. You can either align the body with the mind, or the mind with the body. And if we follow the second this option now of aligning the body with the mind, we can see that this becomes the more popular option, or rather even the only acceptable option, because to do it other way around is to take away that person's individuality. And if you bring this together with the fact that affirmation treatment of gender dysphoria does not seem to work, the fact that to affirm the person in their gender dysphoria does not work. It still leads, and I may have left this out a bit in the beginning, but gender dysphoria has, those who suffer under this suffer tremendously under mental issues, depression, suicidal thoughts, and all those things come together. It's a really a big issue, and that's why we want to talk about it again. And affirmation treatment of gender dysphoria does not seem to work in reducing any of these problems that people suffering gender dysphoria have, which makes the people think, then we need a more drastic step. We have to go into surgery. And the problem with this is this surgery is quite often or mostly irreversible. Infertility being one of the few side effects. And the problem is that even though this sexual reassignment surgery seems to give a relief, it only seems to be temporary. So after having gone under sex change surgery, so from a man to woman with whatever process you want to do there, it seems that nothing has really changed in their dysphoria, they are still experiencing suicidal thoughts, they are still suffering anxiety, they're still suffering substance abuse. All of these things do not go away with sexual reassignment surgery or any kind of hormonal treatment. And what this has led a lot of people to say, and Gustav Thom will also talk about this later, is that the problem may already come with puberty. So we see the people and we're dealing with them a bit later and we're saying, okay, but now you've had all the hormones of the other sex that you did not want. So if you were a boy growing up and you think you're a girl, you went through puberty, becoming a boy, getting all those hormones, and that's a problem, they say, because all those hormones then just add to the stress, which makes the people want to use puberty blockers, which is a thing that is already being readily done and very easily done. Actually, it was quite terrifying when I did a bit of research on this, on how quickly these puberty blockers are just given to people who are saying, without any kind of, young people as well, without any kind of checkup, puberty blockers are encouraged to be given out without even knowing the proper long-term effects of these puberty blockers, not knowing what will happen to this person if we put them on puberty blockers. Will this hormonal treatment damage them in some way? And yes, like I said, there will be many side effects, but Tom will talk a bit more about that now. And that brings up the other question that I've already mentioned with the transient and persistent gender dysphoria. If you treat somebody while they are prepubescent, what would have happened if they would have been in a transient one? What if they were part of the 73%? If they say that treatment does increase the risk of you becoming persistent, are you not already making a problem by already going and doing puberty blockers? So that brings us to the basics. How do we deal with this? And this is where my job comes in, basically. Because this whole thing is actually, if we take it, a question of identity. Who are we? Are we a man? Are we a woman? Who are we? What does the world say we are? And while there is no explicit mention of people suffering gender dysphoria in the Bible, I'm pretty sure, some pastor may correct me, but I'm very sure there is not. What the Bible does provide us with gives us a very clear indication of how we can deal with gender dysphoria in a Christian manner. So the first thing we have to kind of remember is we are created. And that means if you go to the beginning of the Bible and read that beautiful passage and says, we are created in the image of God, man and woman, he created them, and it was very good. This image of God, one of the things that I just want to take out here, it's a very beautiful thing when we can go in there, but the main thing is that we are created in the image of God means that we define, or we receive our identity from God. Who we are is not defined by what the world wants or what even we want. It's not defined from somewhere inside of ourselves, but rather completely outside of ourselves, which is very lovely for us Christians, is that our whole identity is based on what God says. And that brings us to this thing. So also the natural law, I'm just bringing that out there. That means God who created us, he knows and he did everything. So he basically put everything in. He did the biology, the physics, and everything. That is all created from God. So with natural law, I'm just quickly saying here that how God created us and how we are made is not just something that is for us to figure out, but is already there from the very beginning. So we are created, and we are created as either man or woman. That is how we are created. We have a body that is who we are. We are not just some souls driving a meat sack around. No, we are, and I like this word, is a psychosomatic unit. It just basically says our soul and our body is both who we are. We are not our soul. We are not just our body. We are both together to basically, that is who we are. That is how God created us. And that body then happens to just be sexed as either man or woman. And anybody who has children or had two different children, a boy and a girl, knows that there's a huge difference already right there that we can clearly see. And anybody who's talked to a woman who's a man, or a man who talked to a girl, woman who talked to a man, knows that we do not think the same. We are built completely biologically very different. And this goes sadly into this whole thing of the modern world brings this thing, everything a man can do, a woman can do, and vice versa, which sounds lovely, but at the same time it wants to take away the uniqueness of each individual sex. We are not made to be equal. We are made to be complementary, helping each other out like a puzzle piece fitting together. And this is actually very interesting, where the world seems to, or where this whole where our whole society seems to be wanting to go against biology. Biology is very clear. Men and women are very different in many ways. And this is not a thing of putting any worth. If we go back to the basics, created man and woman as the image of God. We both have this intrinsic worth that God has given us. But that does not mean we must be exactly the same. That would be a very boring world, and would be, for those who are married, a very boring marriage. I'm not going to go into the gender roles right now, but that is also something that one could talk about here. The next thing we have to recognize is that we as humans are very sinful. That's the whole point of that we want to talk about, is we are sinful, and people who suffer from gender dysphoria are sinners, just as all those who don't. That is not this is not a thing of they are more sinners and we are less sinners. That is not what we're talking about. We want to look at this thing as gender dysphoria is a thing that we want to look at as seeing this person needs help. A sinner needs to recognize that he needs help. That's the ones who are not suffering gender dysphoria and those who are. And this is just a bit of Latin. Just means when we start looking only in ourselves, that is when we see the most sin. When we want to look down, my vicar father always called it a belly button faith. As if we just look down at our belly button, that is where the sin is the most, because that is where we want to just look and define ourselves from, and that is where we go against what the image of God is being defined by what God is. And then you also get this this thing, which also was a very big argument with the homosexual debate a few years ago, was the person born this way or wasn't he? And they're like, if he was born this way, then it's okay. If he wasn't, then it can be sin and it's bad. And it's actually a very bad form of argumentation, because being born this way does not make it good or wrong. We believe that we are sinful completely. Even we are born as sinners, made as sinners in the womb. And that is, if you're born this way, if you're born with gender dysphoria, it doesn't tend to make it right. Or if you're born as not with gender dysphoria, it also doesn't make you less of a sinner. We are all sinful, and that is a very important thing. But that does not mean we kind of sit back and say, oh, sin is okay. No, we are called to fight against this sin. We are called to fight against our sinful ways. And this goes against the two very hyper tolerance that you see in the world right now. Oh, you do you and I do me and everything is fine. And that's a very unloving form of love, being okay with the other person damaging themselves and hurting themselves. If we believe that God has given us all these laws and rules, not because he's a cruel God, but because he loves us, then we know that living according to them is what's best for us. Then we want this for the other person as well. We can't just say, oh, you do you and I'll do me. No, we are actually called to help this person and point out and help them. And we'll talk about how we go about this. And then it gets often thrown at us Christians is this very beautiful verse that Jesus says, judge not that you be not judged. And it's a very mean thing to say to us, because then we always put on our backbeat and be like, oh, we can't judge them. And that's not a thing that we are wanting to do. We're not here to judge the other person. with our own judgment. That passage doesn't say, that passage clearly says we should not judge with our own judgment because we don't know what's right and wrong. But it does give us, or God gives us his judgments many times. So we can, in a loving way, actually have God's judgment and show that, tell that to people. That is not a form of judgment. That is trying to help the person in a very loving way. Because we know if we just let them do what they want, that will not be for their benefit, or as we read in Romans 1, therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. We are called not to give up this truth. We are called with love to help the other person see the error of their ways. We are called to proclaim the law and the gospel in all situations. Because yes, they are sinners, but just as everyone else is. And they, just as everyone else, will remain an unrighteous sinner unless they repent and receive new life through Jesus Christ. That's the message that we have to give, which is a very beautiful message, because it doesn't end. The lovely thing is our identity is not just that we are sinners. It's so much more. We have an overarching identity, I want to call it. It's one that goes over everything. It goes over the fact if we're man, woman, if we are gender, transgender or not. It goes over if we're sinner, and that's the fact that we are baptized. Because yes, we are sinful creatures, but more than that, we are saved sinners. And this identity, this baptismal identity, which is very lovely when we say this, is we are made righteous, not because of anything that is in us, but by something that is completely outside of our sinful being. What Christ has done for us on the cross and on the resurrection, which we just celebrated so nicely, all of that defines us now. Christ has given us his righteousness and clothes us with it. We are now suddenly made completely new, and it doesn't matter what is underneath that. That is who we are now defined as. That is our first and foremost identity. And this identity should shape our eschatological hope. That means our hope in the future, because we know that even though we may be sinners, even though we may be transgender, homosexual, I don't know what else you can think of right now, all those things, we have a hope that that won't be like that always. As baptized Christians, we know that we have a hope that goes beyond. Yes, transgender people will one day know congruity between their objective bodies and their mental experiences of their sex. And as such, we should maybe, on a side note, treat our bodies as if we would be keeping them forever. Maybe not go into things that are irreversible in this world. Treat them as if they are just playthings to play with. And this identity, this Christian identity of being baptized should shape all our other identities. That is who we are. We are saved by Christ and he is coming again. That should be everything we do. And our bodies should, as such, not just be bodies that we just carry around till we die, but our bodies are a temple of God which we use to thank and praise, to serve and obey him. This is the tool that he has given us on this earth. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Also from the book of Romans. So the pastoral guidelines that I've worked out are really just guidelines, because in these cases, it will be a long process. If you're dealing with a person who's dealing with gender dysphoria, it's a almost lifelong process that you are starting. It's not something that you can just be like, I talked to you, I gave the presentation, that was not even 30 minutes, we are done. No, it goes a bit longer than that. So these pastoral guidelines were firstly written also for pastors in mind, but are also very applicable for everybody else. So these guidelines are to be used with love, but also tough love. Because we have to have if we have a complete, correct understanding of human sexuality, we would be very misguided to deal with people afflicted with gender dysphoria if we only rely on, if I can say, compassion. If there's a willful disregard for God's purposes for our bodies, they must sometimes be reproved. Again, with tough love, not just tough. You can't take out the love. Because even though people don't want to talk about this, to talk about gender dysphoria, because of fear of being ridiculed, labeled, mentally unwell, or judged, the process of having someone to walk with them and guide them with God's word and help them and actually just support them is incredibly vital. They need the support group. And at the moment, transgender people are just getting that whole support group online by the transgender community that says, you're fine just the way you are. We'll support that for you. So it's very important that it will not help to condemn these people and be like, you're shunned, we don't want you in our perfect church. What will the other churches think if we have a transgender person? They'll judge us. But we want to invite these people, all the while loving the sinner and discouraging the sin. It's the perfect, I think the Christian faith does this very beautifully, of just loving the person without having to love the sin in them. So it will be very important that we also treat gender dysphoria as a disorder, because that is what we are dealing with. We are not just dealing with the problem is not only that they feel bad about feeling like a woman. The problem is already at the root that they think they are something that they are not. That they have a problem, that they are thinking they should be something other than what they were created. And I really like that we are, as a church of sinners. Because as a church, we should emphasize that we are a place for of the world. Because all too often when people look at the church, they have this hypocrite, they say, oh, the church is hypocritical because they're sinners. I'm like, yes, we are full of sinners. Because often they think, oh no, this church should be, and we often as Christians often also think this, we should be this perfect place of saints, of morally pure saints. And then people think we look down on disdain on everyone on the outside. But we are made for a broken church. We are a church of sinners. Everyone who's here is a sinner. And we are made for all the sinners out there. A church that can offer a identity that people can actually hold on, especially when they're struggling with their own identity. Because it should actually be, and it should have been the same with homosexuality, is homosexuals and people who are suffering from gender dysphoria should have been running to our churches. Who better understands the pain, or who better should have better understood the pain of not fitting in anywhere else? Who better to understand than those who are a haven for the troubled, the lost, and the estranged? The church should have been a haven that everybody with any kind of problem should be running to, but for some reason, people don't. And that is the thing we'll have to consider, is how can we bring this over to people in a good way? How can we offer, or what can we offer? And this is also where we have to be very clear. As a church, we do not offer a quick fix or the removal of the cross. We are called to care for a broken world. We offer comfort, if I can say it like that. We offer comfort in Jesus because, yes, we don't need to fix the world. Jesus has already done that on the cross. That is the wonderful thing, is we don't need to fix anything here anymore. That has already been done by Jesus. We are just here taking care of this broken world until he comes again. And the wonderful thing is also a thing that we can carry with us is this verse from 1 Corinthians 10. And also a very important text for people struggling with a cross, be it transgenderism or whatever. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. This is sadly often taken to say, God won't let me experience more than I can handle myself, which is not what he's talking about. He's saying here, I will not let more happen to you than you can deal with, but not alone. I will provide you a support structure. I will provide you a family, friends, and most importantly, I will provide you a church. That is the way that we can endure it. That is the person who's suffering transgender dysphoria probably can't do it alone. He needs a support structure. That's why we have these wonderful things. That's why we use the sacraments. That is why we preach forgiveness, because Christ's blood makes right. It strengthens us and preserves us. And for those who are pastors, using the pastoral blessing is a wonderful thing that we have. I think we often, especially when I was also a layperson and also probably now as well, we often think the pastoral blessing is something that just happens at the end, and then we can go home or to tea or whatever happens next. But this is a wonderful blessing that actually does what it says. It's a performative word in which God is present to comfort and strengthen, and it's something that we can actually and should be using. And the last thing is, we are also called to discipline, though. And sometimes, and this is where the tough love comes in, we use Christian discipline, but not to kick them away, not to be like, oh, we don't want you here, but rather to make them see the seriousness of what they're doing, hoping and praying that this will lead them to repentance, to trust in God's promise of deliverance, and to order their life, hopefully, in the accord with the Creator's intent. Because one of the main things that we'll have to do now, or rather before the time, because to do this, to teach rather before gender dysphoria has happened in your congregation will be much easier than to do it when it has already happened. So it will be very, very important to provide a clear teaching of human sexuality according to God's word. What does it mean to be a man and a woman? Can there be a difference? Can there be a men's club? Can there be a women's circle? Can there be a teenager class for just boys, someone for just girls? All these things. Can we build up gender in a positive way and give gender a positive identity rather than what is being shown in the world? Because their sex is clear. We want that to be a very clear message. We cannot alter this by any hormonal conditioning or surgery. You'll just end up doing something to a man or woman who will just be a disfigured man or a disfigured woman afterwards. But if you already have a person who's already undergone sexual reassignment surgery, this will take lasting pastoral care or lasting support. As I said, this was written for pastors, but this will take long-lasting support from whoever is helping these people. They will need to deal with this irreversible surgeries their whole lives. And this also means that we have to provide continuous education for everyone and for different age groups. What does it mean for parents? How do parents deal with a child who's come out as transgender? How do you not kick them away, but keep them in the church? How do they deal with even the shame of this happening? Because there is still a lot of shame linked to this. And especially teenagers and small children, to talk about this before they've gone through the whole thing, before this whole idea, and before they are being pumped full of the ideas from the outside, we want to give them a counter, or rather the counter, the truth. Which brings us to the question of therapy. And this is also maybe a good thing for most people here to hear, is your pastor is not a clinical therapist, and as such, he cannot do clinical therapy, and as such, there will be a suitable therapist needed. Pastors are great, and they should be used. You should use them in these situations, but not alone. Suitable therapist means one who does not affirm this kind of gender ideology, which we've been talking about, that the person, we're looking for a therapist who actually believes that this person is a baptized Christian first and foremost. We're looking for a therapist, and this is always not easy to find, that actually conforms with our ideals of what it means to be a Christian. So how do we respond to these 4 categories? Because I said there's 4 categories, and how do we deal with them? So the first part, I think, would be to deal rapid onset gender dysphoria as a phase. But this does not make it any less unproblematic. You still will deal with a lot of issues on the whole. This means if you notice suddenly that in your school 15 girls are all suddenly transgender, you're probably dealing with rapid onset gender dysphoria. Dealing with it as a phase means there's other issues that are probably leading to this. And especially as we've heard with gender transient and persistent, if 70% of the people desist, and all those who go under, most of those who go under rapid onset gender dysphoria, if it is a phase, will also desist, it seems like the best step would be just to wait. This does not mean like, oh, I'll see you in 18 years or when you're done with puberty. Waiting is not just ignoring. It is actually going with this person, but just waiting with using things that are irreversible. Puberty blockers, sex reassignment surgery, hormonal treatment. All these things are not just something that can leave no lasting damage. So providing pastoral care in even therapy, you want to guide these people and support them all the way until they end with puberty. And then if they persist, you keep going with them. The question of disorder of sexual development would be a bit of a different one. This one would be, because we're also dealing with a biological, physical disorder, it would be best to encourage treatment of the condition in a way that allows the greatest possible fullness of service to Christ and others by the individual. Does this mean sexual reassignment surgery? This will be a very hard thing to say no to straight away, because at the beginning, we won't always know, is this a man, is this a woman? Maybe it is better to bear the cross and be a hermaphrodite for the time being, all in the full knowledge that that is not the way that it will always be. Because sadly, we are called to bear our cross. At the end of the day, this is not an easy thing, and at the end of this presentation, you won't have a quick fix to deal with a person who's dealing with gender dysphoria. That person will still need to bear their cross, and they will need help to bear it. They will require lifelong pastoral care or lifelong help. But especially, and this is the thought I want to end with, even if a lot will not be clear in their lives, if they're man, if they're woman, what is really happening there, one thing is unchangeable, and one thing doesn't change whatever happens. And that is the fact that that person is baptized. That is where we want to go and work with. And yes, that is everything. I am done.
Thank you very much for that, Werner. Strongly from Wittenberg. Then I'll give the word to Gustav Tom to respond from Newcastle, and after that we'll have some time for questions. Thank you, Gustav.
Thomas, can you see my slide now? Not yet.
Yes, we can see it. If you can maybe change it to the full screen, that's right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Good evening to everybody, and thank you to Pastor Stradi. I think it's what he also stressed, quite important to not lose sight of the person behind all of these labels, and that it's a child, it's a brother, it's a sister, and that needs to be treated with empathy. So I think what I decided, we're living in an era of evidence-based medicine now, where everything that we do in the medical sphere has to be based on evidence and science. So what I did for this presentation is I searched on the scientific engines that we normally use for searching, and you'll see that most of what I'll be in my presentation is direct quotes from published articles, and then we can compare how does that compare with what Pastor Strali told us today. So it's a very big area. So I read at least 25 articles, and I'm trying to look at the main findings. When I started with this presentation, I think I had about 60 slides, and I brought them down to something that's a bit more manageable. So basically, we will look at some of the evidence that is used to support the current mainstream debate, consider gender transformation. But from the outset, important that many of the studies quoted are of poor quality and have small sample sizes, which makes the quality of the evidence quite poor. And then the last point is that the pressure is much from society, we say political pressure, to affirm and not to query or study too much. So if somebody says, I've got gender dysphoria, I want to, feeling I'm the other sex, you have to be under pressure to do that instead of saying, let's look at it a bit more. So patients with disorders of sexual development and ambiguous genitalia, it's a small, very special group, like Pastor Strali said, which individualized solutions need to be well considered. And I think science does not have many answers for that, so we're not going to discuss that more. So I think one of the important things to look at is that the risk of suicide is being used a lot by activists to say preventing suicide is one of the main reasons why we should give puberty blockers and hormone treatment. And you can even see the articles that talk about this is a life-saving intervention which we have to give to our children. So however, from the evidence, it does appear that the incidence of thinking about committing suicide, what they call suicidal ideation, is higher in people with gender dysphoria than the general population. But if you look at all the evidence, there's no good support for the argument that there's a high risk of suicide in this group, and even that giving puberty blockers and hormone treatment will prevent suicide, even though it's stated quite often. So it's quite important to note that the psychological distress in gender dysphoria is significant, and it needs to be anticipated and managed. We can't just ignore it and hope it goes away. So here's a quote from one of the articles. It says the evidence is incomplete, but at the very least we can say that a significant number of those who go on to puberty blockers have worse mental health. So they actually feel worse when they're on treatment. And this ought to be conveyed to the child and the parents if you consider them for puberty blockers. So, and you should also not certainly imply that if the child is not giving puberty blockers, there's a high risk of committing suicide. So I think that supports what I was saying before. One of the things I want to look at is how many people actually decide after treatment that they would rather not have had the surgery. So regret is quite small. It's only about 1% in the studies that I've looked at. But it should not be disregarded, because especially if you're going to undertake irreversible interventions like surgery. And if you will see a bit later on, even puberty blockers might cause irreversible effects, even just as medical treatment. Another, which is an important point which I've noticed, is that the childhood gender dysphoria is strongly associated with a lesbian, gay, or bisexual outcome in about 41% of patients. And that raises one of the issues that maybe children are exploring changing gender to fix homosexuality. To say I'm attracted to the opposite sex, maybe to the same sex. Maybe the problem is that I am the wrong sex. I think that's also something which needs to be taken into consideration. We looked at the evidence. I think this is Pastor Strali also quoted this, that available evidence shows that the majority of children, this is a study which looked at 317 children, 85.2% of them, the feelings of gender dysphoria went away around puberty. So we know that the majority of children, this feeling will not persist. But the challenge, of course, is trying to figure out who fits into which group. So one of the important things that has changed recently, that historically you would have young males from birth that from a very young age experienced gender dysphoria. Now it's been changed from what they call birth assigned females in adolescence. So this brings us to the issue of might there be a role being played by the increased access to social media. I think that definitely is something to be looked at. If you can see the prevalence of self-reported transgender identity in children in the US, it's up to from 0.5 to 1.3%, and this is about 200 times higher than even 10 years ago. So I think that definitely shows that something changed, and it's not just that that it's more acceptable. I think we need to look at the role that social media and social pressures play in that. Puberty blockers, yeah, so I want to read this to you. This was in the New York Times. There's emerging evidence of potential harm from using blockers. These drugs suppress estrogen and testosterone. These hormones help develop the reproductive system, but also affect bones, brain, and other parts of the body. And the problem is that during puberty, that's when your bone mass surges and gets established for life. When you're using a puberty blocker, your bone density stops increasing and it might never recover. That means that people could be at risk for fractures, for osteoporosis in their 50s instead of later on, as is normal. And then many doctors are trying to alleviate this by giving puberty blockers very early, as early as age of 8, and then starting with 6 hormones for 12 to 13. I think that it helps to people become better aligned with their gender identity and helps protect their bones. But what this does, it forces people to make a life-altering choice before the patients know who they really are. Puberty can help to clarify gender. For some adolescents, reinforcing their sex at birth. Others confirm they are transgender. So the argument is that it buys you time. But if you look at it might be that they actually don't buy you time, but they effectively lock in your child to a treatment pathway. Once you decide to go into puberty blockers, it's very difficult, and most people go on to take hormone treatment. So actually making a very important decision very early in life before the child actually doesn't know who he is. I think something that I picked up, which is for me quite important, is that brain development and maturation continues at least until the mid-20s. And there's good evidence that testosterone and estrogen contribute to this development of your brain. So we don't know what the effect of blocking these sex hormones during a critical age for brain development is. So it might be dependent on the age of which puberty begins, and delaying this might have irreversible consequences. We just don't have good enough evidence to know. The fact that adolescents with gender dysphoria may be given sex hormones from the other sex later on is also a problem, because we do not know how this biological male or female brain will mature when it's now in the influence of hormones associated with the opposite biological sex. I think this just shows that the evidence, the studies that we've done, evidence that we have, is actually out of keeping with what we're doing. Giving puberty blockers is something which is very unstudied and based on very little evidence, and might have very bad long-term effects. Just saying it in a different way, the clear signals emerging from various reviews of available evidence of the use of puberty blockers are that there's a very low certainty of the benefits of puberty blockers, an unknown risk of harm, and a need for more research. As doctors, we also have to say, first, do no harm. So if you want to do that, is to proceed with extreme caution, especially given the rapidly rising case numbers and the novel presentations, like I said, the older girls. I've made a long presentation with lots of the evidence and articles quoted, so I think we'll make it available if people are interested in a bit more deeper reading. This is one of the articles which I found quite helpful. It's basically on ethics, but entitled Puberty Blockers for Children, Can They Consent? But it actually does quite a good job of quoting all the evidence, like I talked about suicide and mental health, and it actually criticizing them and commenting on them. So I think it's a good place to start. And from there, you can go to the other articles if you're more interested. So he talks about this, that's what we said before, the politics of affirmation. There's been a trend amongst activists and those working gender clinics that a young person says is only to be affirmed and supported. And that seems to be at odds with any normal diagnostic process. As an example, if a young 18-year-old comes to me as a doctor and say, I want to have a tubal ligation hysterectomy because I don't want to have children, we need to have a discussion. Do you understand what the implications are? Why? What are the reasons behind it? That would be a normal therapeutic relationship, a normal diagnostic process. For gender dysphoria, it's not seen as the right thing to do. So there's pressure on the doctors and nurses to say, it's not saying, how do we feel? Are you sure you feel? But when can we start your puberty blockers? I think that's been found in the UK with their clinic, that they had big problems because of this automatic affirmation, and that led to quite a bit of regret as well. So a blanket policy of affirming gender dysphoria as a primary condition is unhelpful, untherapeutic, and may prevent children from naturally over time becoming comfortable with their natal sex. Seeking consent to treat the gender dysphoria puberty blockers is strongly linked to the string to affirm rather than further examine, and is a trend that's more socio-political than is based on science. And I think that's a lot of the aspects of gender dysphoria is about socio-politics rather than good science. As a final point, puberty blockers have known serious side effects with uncertainty about their long-term use. They do not improve mental health. Without medication, most will desist from dysphoria over time. Yet, and I think it's also important, 90% of those treated with puberty blockers progress to gross sex hormones and often surgery with irreversible consequences. So the moment that you start puberty blockers, you start them on a pathway which is usually not stopped. The brain is biologically and socially immature in childhood and unlikely to understand the long-term consequences of treatment. That's why it concludes that children are unable to consent to the use of puberty blockers. And that means that the parents have to consent with the child, but which parent can make a decision like this on behalf of their child and be happy with that decision? I think the conclusion that I came to is that many different viewpoints are available in scientific articles with criticism and most of the available evidence and a real shortage of high quality, reliable research. However, there's no good evidence that blocking puberty and giving hormone treatments is associated with a low risk of suicide or improvement in mental health. Studies have reported that the majority of adolescents and children with gender dysphoria will experience desistance and become happy with the sex they were born with, the gender they were born with. Puberty blockers have significant side effects and unknown long-term effects. More and better quality evidence is needed before science-based decisions can be made with any certainty. And I think just as a last comment, in short, one can make a good scientific argument that for children and adolescents with gender dysphoria, proper professional psychological assessment and treatment is a prudent and evidence-based strategy instead of immediate, unquestioning, knee-jerk affirmative medical treatment with puberty blockers and hormones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustav and Werner, both for the time and the effort you put into this important thing we are dealing with, so that we can help those who come with these issues to us, or maybe we ourselves are grappling with them. Now we have time for questions. I will ask those who want to ask questions either to write them in the chat or raise their hands, and then I will try to get to the people who have raised their hands. I think Tante Helga Hiesterman is the first who has raised her hand. If you would like to ask a question. Bitte, Tante Helga. Du müsstest, glaube ich, erstmal dein Mikrofon anschalten.
Thomas?
Helga, hast du eine Frage für Werner oder Gustav?
Leider nicht. Ich glaube, ich habe da irgendwie ein Fehler. Oder noch nicht jetzt.
Kein Problem, okay. Are there any other questions? Andere Fragen? Like I said, you can also write them in the chat if you want to. Congratulations, Werner and Gustav. You have answered all questions on this very difficult topic. Then I think if there are no more questions, I want to give you a quick, maybe a chance again, Werner, if you would like to respond to what Gustav said.
I got my wrong ear in. No, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity, but also Gustav, thank you for that. It was very good to see also as a pastor dealing with a lot of medical journals was very daunting for me, and to see that how you did was very lovely. So just thank you for all that work, Gustav. Tom, yeah, Gustav.
Perhaps just one comment from our side, Thomas, if I may. This is Victor.
Yeah, Victor.
Yeah, it's just quite apparent for me that even from a very young age, in some cases, one can see a child developing certain traits which are very opposite to the sex that the child was born with. Often one has the feeling that a person decides all of a sudden to want to relate to a certain sex group. But yeah, as I mentioned, often it's the case that from a very young age, it's quite apparent that there's something that is amiss in this child or different. Yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Thomas, let me say, I think that's what Werner talked about. That is what you call the real gender dysphoria. That is quite rare. That does happen. It is something that does happen, that you do have children that from very young age experience the gender dysphoria. But I think that's something that's quite rare, and what we're dealing with now is a little bit different.
Okay, thank you, Werner. Would you also want to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think just also on a normal perspective of just growing up, you also know that what do we decide is the thing that we don't consider as part of the gender. Like a tomboy, my wife was a tomboy, but she's very much a tomboy, and now she is very much a female woman. So it's the thing of where do we see the line of what we want? Because yes, gender dysphoria does exist, but often we want to judge by our standards, and that's where I'm like, be very careful with putting the judgment, especially as parents, putting the judgment on your children, being like, and this also deals with homosexuality, like, oh, that's what you're just doing is just very feminine, therefore you must be this, and then you actually end up affirming him rather than just helping him deal with why is he wearing mom's shoes, is most likely not because he's transgender in most cases.
Thomas Lennon has got his hand up.
Okay, then if we can, I think Lennon and then Lutz.
Good evening, Tom and Werner. Thank you so much for your presentations. I have a question that's pretty much for both of you. In all of the research that you've done, what is your sense that you get from taking an intricate look at this movement, whether it's something that is like a wildfire just taking over everywhere, or in all of your research did you find a sense that there's a strong resistance movement building up as well, that I suppose for those of us that see this as a big threat, gives you a little bit of hope that I'm sort of also speaking about in my own experience. I see a lot of this sort of stuff on social media, and it seems in California it's quite rampant, where the schools are trying to keep the parents away from these things being discussed in classrooms, but the schools, the parents have also started fighting back quite a lot. So there's some seemingly strong resistance movements against it too. And I was just wondering what your how you saw this in all the intricate research that you've done on this topic.
I think one of the things that is happening is that more and more countries are raising the age at which you can start hormone treatment. And some of them are saying only after 18. They're recognizing that that is something that's irreversible and can't be started too early. But I think it's part of I think probably our society, this individual is whatever you feel is right, and nobody can tell you that it's wrong. I think so. But I think there is definitely a movement that says that this is going a bit too far. Thanks.
Yeah, I saw a similar trend that is happening. So I would say this the social side of it may be like in fire, but I mean, I do see a counter movement working against, which is parents taking quite a big interest into what is happening in schools especially, which is a lovely thing. Side note there, that parents take in more active roles in the schools. But the thing that I mentioned that at the beginning, is gender dysphoria as such is not going away. The social aspect of it may, but there will still be all those people dealing, like even in a huge country that we are with millions of people, there are people who are suffering real gender dysphoria without anything. And that's where I'm like, how do we approach these people openly? Even the people who are going with social things, Jesus died for all these people's sins, the people who are, as we might say, a bit crazy in a not in a thing view, or just all the people who conform to our way of thinking. We want all these people to come to church, and Jesus is, we want to be very clear in how can we be the most open to people. And if this trend ever does die down, gender dysphoria will not die down completely ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Lennon. Gustav, I think Lutz was next.
I just want to share an experience. Sometimes I feel ashamed of myself that I thought this. Victor mentioned that from an early age that you can sometimes see that something is amiss. I met a man who was maybe in his early 30s, and my very first impression was that he was gay. His voice was high, his motions were feminine, so I just made up my mind this guy is feminine. And after a few months that I knew him, I heard that he was married and he's got children. So, as I say, I was ashamed that I had already put this person into a box. But then, surprisingly, last year, the person got divorced and he is living a gay life. And that confuses me a little bit, or it is, maar het is traurig drüber. It confused me that this person was appeared feminine, was married, and is gay. It's just a comment that I want to make.
Thank you, Lutz. Werner, Gustav, do you want to respond to that?
I think just mustn't confuse too much homosexuality and gender dysphoria, but I think it's important for us to treat people with respect.
And I think it's also what we want to keep emphasizing is, where do we get the identity from this person? Like, what is the most important thing about this person that we want to be dealing with? And that is their relationship to God. How do we figure that out? Because and that's maybe dealing with the previous question as well. This is maybe where, I'm sorry, Gustav, I'm bringing them together again, where homosexuality and gender dysphoria do come together. It is a question of identity, which that's why the world is packing them together. And that's also why we'll have to deal with them often together. And in these cases, it is, how do you deal with it? I don't have any clear answers, but that we just have that in mind, is how do we keep the identity of this person and help him see his identity not as his sexual desires, but first and foremost as a Christian or as a child of God.
Thank you. Any more questions? Feel free to raise your hand or write a comment in the chat.
Yeah, Thomas, maybe just from my side here, Pastor Martin Paul here from Johannesburg. I think it also helps as a parent to think about this. You'll probably need to play, as you already said, a more active role as parents into our schools and everything. In my circumstances, there are a lot of, or my child is exposed to a lot of different types of children with their influences, and just playing an active role in the children encourages us quite a lot. To see how we can talk about with our son at a very young age. He's 7 years old, and we already have to talk with him about these kinds of discussions, and then thinking about it clearly. So it helps that we have these discussion points here on Teams, so that we can help our children in that regard.
Thank you, Martin. Anything else? Every crisis is a good opportunity also. Often the children see things clearer than we do. They see the obvious. Butch Knackenbeck.
Just a quick comment regarding maybe the pastoral care. I learned also from the book from Harold Zenkbeil that he makes a nice distinction between guilt and shame. Those who sin have guilt, and Werner also mentioned it already, and it's very interesting to note that Christ, through the forgiveness of sins, our sins are forgiven, our guilt is taken away, and also the shame is taken away, for instance, through the Lord's Supper, where the people are incorporated again into the holy body of Christ. In other words, so we can see that also, and if we have such people in our congregations, remind them of this, that if they go to the Lord's Supper, they are incorporated back again. Their shame is also taken away. Both their guilt and their shame can be taken away by the church. And I want to emphasize, that is what we as the church can give to them. We can't give them all these other psychological things, but we can give them that their guilt is taken away and that their shame is removed. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Support. Any other points? According to the timeline, it's our schedule, we have a few minutes left. Maybe to start thinking about closing remarks now. Okay, then I maybe close by saying thank you to all of you who took the time to deal with this issue. Thank you for those people here, especially Werner and Gustav, who opened our minds. And yeah, we want to continue this type of conversation. It seems like it's received a good response this evening. If there are any topics touching on bioethics and also people you think who are competent to deal with these topics, please feel free to write to me or to call me, and then we can look at inviting them. Nombuso from Johannesburg has already pointed to the effect that, I hope I say it correctly, the social media, but also some specific apps or so where people have these alternative identities, how that then has a role on the other identity as a human being. So we add identity again, how if we can look at that. Yeah, so we'll see if we can bring up topics in the future. If there's anything specific you think we should address, please feel free to contact me on that. Then I would like to close with Our Father. I think if I can pray it with the mic on and others can also pray, but maybe switch off their mic, otherwise it gets a bit confusing. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. The Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the one who created us, the one who redeemed us, and the one who sanctifies us, makes us holy, bless and keep you, now and always. Amen. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.